We are good to go. So why don't we start this halacha again, halacha tes, because we had just started it yesterday. Mitzias beno uvito hasmuchem al shulchano. This is sort of a domestic policy that the chachamim came up with, in order so that people living under the same roof should have some kind of harmony amongst them, especially when there are financial issues involved between them. So therefore, they said that if a son or daughter are dependent on their father, afal pi shehim gedolim, even if they're adults, harehu shalo, the items that they find from hefker, they must surrender to their father. And the chachamim tiknu lo mipnei derech shalom, and our Chazal awarded the father this right in order to preserve the peace, because he is, after all, providing for his children, and as we learned yesterday, that he's doing this out of his own benevolence to his children, and so the least they can do is do some kind of reciprocation. Velo lahazanan, but if, let's say, I'm sorry, I skipped the line. Avalim ein beno samach al shulchano, afal pishu hukatan mitziyasu la'atzmo. But if a child is not a dependent on his father, right? Let's say the father is living in a different city and the child's on his own, or is living with a relative or something, or with a friend, and the child is not a dependent on his father, so then the child gets to keep his own items, velo lahazanan, and it does not have to surrender it to the person under whose tutelage he's living. Lefi shelo tiknu mipnei derech shalom elu la'av velo la'acher. Because when the Chachamim made this accommodation of maintaining the peace, it was only to maintain peace between a parent and a child, and not between another person and this child. And so therefore, if a child finds a lost object, even though it could potentially create resentment that the child gets to keep it and does not have to surrender it to the person who's sustaining him, but nonetheless, he's not obligated to surrender it. I just had an image of Willy Wonka and little Charlie found the golden ticket. He wanted to share it with his uncle. I don't remember what the guy's name was. Anyway, Hazan b'toras tzedakah mipnei she'im lo yazun hu yazunu acherim. He says, basically, v'lo la'acher hazan b'toras tzedakah, that we do not award his lost objects to another person who was doing an act of tzedakah by sustaining this child and feeding the child. And the reason is mipnei she'im lo yazun hu yazunu acherim. And the argument being is that if this person does not sustain him, other people will. Sherabim mutsuyim hazanim u'mefarnesim b'derech tzedakah. Because there are many members of the Jewish community who are benevolent and will provide tzedakah to this child if necessary, and therefore the Chachamim only made this accommodation between a parent and a child. And even though what this person is doing is very benevolent by bringing in this child who's not his own son into his home, nonetheless the Chachamim only awarded it to a parent and did not award it to this fellow, because even though he may have a good argument, hey, look at what I'm doing for this kid, the Chachamim turn around and say to him, it's a wonderful thing that you're doing, but realize that if you don't do it, someone else will do it, because we as the Jewish people always take in orphans and widows, and therefore we're not here to give you a big medal or to give you a big trophy, and therefore the child gets to keep his lost objects. Now, that's all when it comes to a son or a daughter who are minors. Aval bito ad shetibager mitziyasa le'aviha, afal pi she'ena semucha al shulchana. Now, when it comes specifically to a daughter, a father is entitled to her the objects that she finds from Hefker, even if she's not a dependent on his table, until she reaches the age of Bagrus, which is an age that's described by the Gemara as she's gone through puberty, and she's also reached the age of 12 and a half years old. And the reason why there's a special accommodation that the father gets to keep her lost objects, even if he's not financially responsible for her, is for the following reason. The Imrei Yaakov says in Lamed Gimel, Avali medayin lo bagra afshihi naira ve'ena birshus aviha lemochra. He says the father has no control over her once she reaches the age of 12, but through the age of 12 and a half, she has to surrender the items she finds from Hefker to her father. And the reason is, the rabbi still made this accommodation that the father gets her lost objects, and you're not going to like this reason, but it's based on the Torah. Because it's the father's privilege to marry off his minor daughter to whomever he pleases, and he could exploit her in a way that will make her life miserable by marrying her off to an unsavory character. And because of the fact that the father sort of controls whom she will marry when she's a minor, we, out of appreciation for the fact that he's going to marry her off to a nice person, or maybe not marry her off at all, then for that reason alone, she must surrender items that she acquires from Hefker. Masha enkin bevito bogeres shiyatzim reshus avia legamrei mishum hachi davkim hismuch al shulchan avia mitziyas shayich lo. But once she reaches the age of 12 and a half, she's considered to be halachically a legal adult, and therefore she is no longer controlled by her father. The father can no longer decide whom she's going to marry. And as a result, if he's not financially supporting her, there is no kind of reciprocation that she has to offer to him because she's not receiving any favors from him. And therefore, if she is receiving favors because he's financially providing for her, then she has to surrender her lost items, but her found items. But if not, then she doesn't have to once she reaches the age of 12 and a half. Now, I recognize that this is all extremely foreign from a cultural standpoint, but it is, I guess, important to put ourselves in a position of looking at it from a medieval or ancient world perspective, that this was the way parents and children related to each other. Parents brought children into the world not only for altruistic reasons, not only because children were a blessing, but also because children were providers also for the family, like we talked about yesterday. And the Torah does award a father a right to make a shidduch for his minor daughter from the time that she's born until she reaches the age of 12 and a half, where she's considered to be old enough to decide on her own whom she wishes to marry. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that it was routinely done that children got married at the age of 6 or 7 years old, but it does mean that a father could arrange a marriage. He could do an arranged marriage while his daughter was a minor, wait a few years until she became of age, and then she would get married. And it was typical to get married at the age of 12 or 13. That was typical in the old world until probably the last couple of centuries. Okay, so I just want everyone to know that. This is not like absolute barbarism. This was pretty standard stuff. Remember, people didn't live very long. You were lucky if you lived to be 60. So getting married at 12 or 13 was not unusual because you didn't have that much time. People today are getting married in their 30s because they figure, look, I got plenty of time ahead. Let me start my career and think about my education and take care of all that stuff, and then I'll worry about marriage if I ever do decide to get married, because we're living in a crazy world today where marriage is no longer valued as an institution that much. Okay. Anyway, so
Rabbi, just what about the free will though of the minor? I mean, her life is being set up where she's not going to have any free will of her own life.
that's true. Although it's a who said that she gets who said that she gets to decide that. I mean, my children didn't get to decide what school they went to, so this is not that much different. Remember that line from was it Red Fox, from Sanford and Son? He said, "I brought you into this world. I'm going to take you out." It's like I mean, the attitude in the old world was that I brought you into this world, and I'll decide for what is best for you. And there were financial advantages. If I have a daughter who is healthy, and she's a virgin, and she's capable of bearing children, and then I have a guy who's interested in my daughter, and I could this is a financial enterprise. This is actually, I could be set for the rest of my life by making a business arrangement with this fellow who wants to marry my daughter. This was routinely done. Children were used for financial gain. And even though we don't think those ways any longer, thankfully not, but that was pretty standard. That, there were arranged marriages all the time.
Rabbi, further question.
Yeah.
You kind of said that it's possible. I don't want to misinterpret what you said about that father could marry off his daughter to an unsavory character. Obviously, I assume you're not saying this was something that was encouraged to do. This was
No,
something
no,
that was
right. All it's saying is that she sort of a sense of, or that the Chachamim view that she has a sense of indebtedness to him because he's going to treat her nicely. That
right.
she that he's not going to marry her off to an unsavory character. A menuvel
Okay.
and a mukashchin. A menuvel is a disgusting person. A mukashchin is a person who's got bodily, unseemly kinds of bodily conditions like boils or bad body odor or things like that. You know.
Right. But my question for you, it's more philosophical. Why would the Torah, we all agree, is written for all time? And
Yes.
obviously culturally we're different than let's say people were back then. Why would the Torah allow a system which could be open to abuse? So for example, you just mentioned even for, like you gave the example of choosing your child's school, which I agree, we don't allow them input, but a school versus being consigned to a marriage potentially for 50 years, to an unsavory character or, etc. I would argue it's a little bit different, but why would the Torah allow such a situation to, you know, exist?
Well, I would suggest, first of all, I would suggest to you that yes, it's true that the Torah is written for every generation, but and this is a larger philosophical discussion. There are so many areas of the human condition where there are certain social rights that the Torah awards people that we've advanced beyond over the course of millennia. The Torah allows for slavery. And someone could ask the question, how could the Torah allow for slavery if the Torah is meant for all generations? And the answer is because the Torah has to address earlier periods of human civilization where slavery was viewed as an acceptable norm within any economic system. This was a way that people could survive by selling themselves permanently as an indentured servant so that they would have a roof over their head and food in exchange for work permanently. Now, for many of us, that seems to be inhumane. But the fact of the matter is that when people were literally starving to death on the street, that was considered to be a way of sustaining people's lives. And standards have changed since then, and we've advanced. That doesn't mean that the Torah is archaic. It still means that even when that socioeconomic phenomenon is no longer present, we can learn rules from there. So what do we learn from slavery? That even when you have the upper hand over another human being, you have an obligation of treating that person benevolently, of not abusing that person, and all of the halachot that are contained about slavery that are contained in the Torah. Now, the same principle is true. The fact of the matter is that society has not changed so radically in its attitudes between parents and children. There's still a recognition that a parent does control to a certain degree their child's destiny, because the understanding is that a parent who has lived life a little bit longer, who has certain objective values that they wish to impart to a child who may be too young to understand what is best for the child, a parent does get to decide what certain things that will affect the destiny of their children for their entire life. Deciding who their child is going to marry is actually a service to the child, especially when the difficulties of finding your own spouse are extremely difficult when a person is, let's say, an orphan. Children would be tremendously grateful to have parents, when there were high rates of children being orphans at a young age. If you had a father, you had a tremendous advantage of finding a very good match within society, especially in a patriarchal society where women were economically extremely disadvantaged. They would be very grateful for their father to find a shidduch for them. What are you concerned about? Love? Love is not something that is a criterion for marriage. The biggest criterion for marriage in the old world was who's going to take care of me financially. And, and it was only in the last 150 years where we became more luxurious society, in Shalom Aleicham's Fiddler on the Roof. That's what the whole story is about. It's the old world meeting the new world, where, Tzeitel says, I want to marry Matel, and the father can't believe that his daughter would even question his choice for a shidduch for her. That's where we're reading about the cusp of a change within societal norms. It only starts in the 19th century, right? So it's the fact that there's more independence between parents and children, and we give our children more independence to choose what they would like to do with their lives, is purely a product of socioeconomic standards having risen dramatically in the last 150 years. And if the poverty rates were what they were over 150 years ago, we would still be probably finding matches for our children, and our children would have the greatest of appreciation for it. One of the sad, unfortunate byproducts of living in a luxurious society is that it has caused the disintegration of family, where children no longer need their parents, parents no longer feel that sense of domination over their children, but if anything, it's just the opposite. That parents have sort of capitulated to their children so much autonomy that it comes to great detriment to the children. Parents are allowing their children to decide what they want to do at ages which is very, very detrimental to them when they still don't know what they want. I mean, look at the biggest issue in the news today, where parents are letting their children decide if they would like gender reassignment surgery, which is the most it's the greatest dereliction of a parental responsibility that I've ever heard of in my life. But now it's becoming more and more acceptable for parents to turn to a 5-year-old child and say, it's okay, you get to decide whatever you would like to be. If you want to be an astronaut, you be an astronaut. You want to be the president of the United States, you can be the president. If you want to be a female, because you're presently a male, or vice versa, that's perfectly up to you. You get to decide anything that you want. And so we've gone totally, the pendulum has swung totally in the other direction, and in many ways it's been extremely, extremely detrimental to small children. So here we're reading about a socioeconomic phenomenon that is present because of the economic standards being so poor that it was a privilege to have if I'm a female, it's a privilege for me to have an intact father and mother. Because it's not as common as it is today. It's a privilege for my father to find the shidduch for me, because he will be able to barter my marriage in exchange for financial security, and I will have financial security for the rest of my life, being able to marry into a family that can take care of me so that I can produce the babies, and my husband will take care of me in a very high standard and take care of my children. So everyone benefits from this system when you're living in a very squalid society. Okay? Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Just one thing I
Okay.
just want to add, what you just mentioned, which is horrific. In the United States, either gender, you can go to see a licensed physician as early as the age of 15 without parental consent to start gender reassignment.
Yeah, yeah. It is horrific. The word is horrific. I agree with you. Yeah, yeah. And it's only getting worse, unfortunately, now that we have Sleepy Joe as our president. Because I think the first thing that he did is for the head of what is it, the Department of Health, he appointed a transgender person. He wants to make it a basic civil right to decide what gender you wish to be. It's a basic human right, I think, right now is what society is arguing.
The concern also, Rabbi, just so you know, because this has been talked about by legal analysts in the US, is that it could get to a point where, let's say you have an 8-year-old who, a boy identifies as a girl, and the parents put their foot down, that if the kid tells the teachers that my parents are not accepting me, they could, basically intervene, take the kid away because of discrimination against trans, or whatever. So
Yeah,
there is a concern, that type of thing down the road.
yeah, Big Brother. We are starting to live in a totalitarian society, unfortunately, and it's Wayne. We will be joining you soon, Wayne. That's all I can say.
I don't know if that's
All right.
that's the right reason, but all right.
It's I'll take any reason, but yeah, I mean
Welcome.
it's an unfortunate reality, right? All right. V'chein ma'aseh yadeha, and similarly, all of her handiwork, which means that if a girl is under the age of 12 and a half and she's already working, then all of her work product has to be surrendered to her father. Not only the things that she finds from Hefker, but if she works, let's say she knits or she manufactures, she has to surrender all of her work product to her father until she's no longer under his tutelage for marriage. V'chein mitzias ishto u'maisi yadeha. Now let's talk about spouses. So up until now we've talked about children. I provide for my wife. I give her a good standard of living. I'm obligated to provide her with food and with clothing. And in exchange for that, I, as a husband, am entitled, again, very different from the standards today, but the Talmudic standards are whatever she finds from Hefker, she must surrender to me, and also all of her handiwork, which means that if she produces valuable goods, they belong to me halachically. Now, this is not always the case. Chazal were cognizant of the fact that in rare situations, women's earning abilities were greater than their husbands. This was a rarity, but Chazal did make an allowance for it, and we'll learn about that in the Imrei Yaakov in just a moment. But before we do that, before we talk about spousal rights from an economic standpoint, let's just finish the language of the Rav Shulchan Aruch. V'imnasnu matana livno ulevito haktanim hasmuchim al shulchano. If, let's say, my son or daughter, who are minors and who are my dependents, receive a gift from a third party, okay? They get a friend of theirs gives them a gift for their birthday. Harehu shalo. They must surrender that gift to the parent. Again, because they are dependents, they are minors, and therefore they are completely at the father's financial, under the father's financial control, and therefore whatever they receive as a gift, they must surrender to the father. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that the father has to accept it. He can always be a nice guy and let his children keep it, but halachically, these are his rights. Aval im nasnu livno ulevito hagedolim, afal pi shesmuchim al shulchanu harehu shelahem, but that's only if they're minors. But here's where there's a difference between what they acquire from Hefker and what they acquire as a gift. If they acquire something from Hefker, even if they're adults but they're dependents, they have to surrender that to the father. If they are dependents but they're adults already, meaning they're over the age of 12 and 13, and someone gives them a gift, so you have a third party who is actually transacting with them and giving them or selling them something, so then the child gets to keep it for themselves, even if they are dependents of the father. Va'avdo, and finally, va'avdo v'shivchaso ha'ivra mitziyasan la'atzma. And finally, if a person owns servants, they are Jewish servants, then they are allowed to keep whatever they find for themselves, if they're indentured servants, which of course there's no commentary on, because even in the times of the Rav Shulchan Aruch, that was no longer the standard. Slavery of a Jew enslaving another Jew, I believe, ceased to exist long before the times of the Rav Shulchan Aruch, because we were mostly living in the diaspora, as far as I can tell, that this was no longer extant, but it's still halachically codified. Now, if we want to just talk about the halacha of spousal rights, the first thing is that whatever a woman finds from Hefker, she has to surrender to her husband. And the Tosfos says, the Imrei Yaakov in Lamed Hey, Kaspa Tosfos Beis Ta'amim Lama Habal Zocha B'Mitzias. There are two reasons why a husband is entitled to his wife's retrieved objects from Hefker. Echad Mishum Mizonos Shenosein La. The first reason is because he financially provides her with food, and because he unilaterally provides her with food, this is her reciprocation. And ve'echad mishum eva. And the second reason is because it's going to create resentment in the relationship if the husband is unilaterally the financial provider and his wife doesn't reciprocate in any way. So, in other words, they're sort of, the Imrei Yaakov understands that there's sort of two different points. Point number one is that she owes him. So this is a quid pro quo. For all of the food that he provides to her, she has to surrender anything she acquires from Hefker. Number two, we want to avoid strife in the relationship. Let her provide, if she were to be able to keep everything that she finds from the outside, the husband's going to come to resent her. We don't want that to happen. However, and that's why he provides the following caveat: V'imbala ani ve'en la mizanos mimenu, elahi torachas v'nizones. But let's say the husband is poor, and she has to earn her own keep and puts food on the table herself. Bazeh mitziyas ulasma. Then she does not have to surrender. She would have to make that argument to the Beis Din. She says, I found a precious jewel. I don't have to surrender this to my husband. He's a ne'er-do-well. He goes and I shouldn't say he's a ne'er-do-well. Maybe he's learning in Kollel, right? And but he's not providing for me, and he expects me to go out and work to put food on the table, which is a whole other discussion. That was never part of, as you can see from here, that was never the design initially in the Talmudic system of finance in the nuclear family. There was never such a concept designed as a lichatchila that the wife went out to work and the husband sat and learned. But we're not going to go there right now. Maybe we'll talk about it later. In this situation where the husband is not feeding her, he has no reason to resent her for being able to keep the things that she finds, because since she is scrounging in order to be able to feed herself, and perhaps even to feed him, he can't have any grievances against her for keeping the things that she acquires from the outside. So it's clear that there's a quid pro quo going on, and when the husband is not providing, she does not have to surrender any of the things that she acquires from the outside to the husband. We'll have to hold it here for today. We'll do the next big paragraph in Imrei Yaakov tomorrow. Okay? All right, and then we got to talk about how do we apply that to our world today, where some